Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Hello, listeners. I am back with Zenica Chatman, and she is a certified personal and executive coach, helping women rediscover their inner strength and confidence in the aftermath of a workplace-related trauma. Oh, I can relate to that on so many levels. Her own journey into coaching and positive psychology began after being left emotionally broken by a pair of workplace bullies at the height of her marketing career. And she went on to create a path to redefine her own self-worth and what it meant to be successful at work. And now she's helped dozens of other women do the same. She is the curator of an 8-week detox program, Surviving Corporate, that helps establish healthy relationships with work and puts women back in the driver's seat of their careers. Welcome, Zenica, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be here.
Oh, it's an honor to have you. Unfortunately, I think a lot of our listeners can relate to your story. And we know when you're not represented in the majority group, as most women, folks of color, those with disabilities, and those with marginalized identities, don't always see themselves reflected, but also experience trauma associated with their identities. I'd love for you to share, if you could, your own personal story that brought you into this work.
Yeah, so I often tell people, as far as the DEI work goes, I never really saw myself as a DEI practitioner or expert or anything like that, and I still struggle with that title today. But my journey into even kind of starting this work really started out of me sharing my story with a couple of girlfriends at brunch, and I was having a really difficult experience at work. It was what I considered to be my dream job. I really thought that I had arrived. All of my hard work, all of the education felt like it culminated into this moment of me having this dream job on this dream team with this incredible company. And it was everything that I thought it was going to be until about 18 months into it, when I was told that I was the absolute worst employee that this particular leadership structure had ever seen. There was no prior indication of that. I had just had a prep for an annual review where none of this came up, none of these issues came up. And it was really discouraging to hear those words verbatim as someone who had put so much of who I was into that role and was so proud of the work that I had done. And I started down a path of, like probably anyone else who hears that, of overworking myself to try to get out of this role as the worst person on the team. I was trying to work myself out of that title. And I would love to tell you all that worked, that they saw that I was putting in all the extra hours, that I was raising my hand for all the extra work, that I was paying out of my pocket to take extra courses in areas where I was told that I needed to improve, that I never had been told I needed to improve before and have not been told since then. But it didn't. It was just a constant barrage of insults, attacks on my character, attacks on my work ethic, actual attempts to undermine and demean the work that I was doing, and just emotional and psychological abuse. And so I was having a conversation with some girlfriends, and I said, gosh, if I could find a word to put to it, I would say that I was just bullied. And it sat like a ton of bricks when I said it, just in my heart and in my head. And I actually went and Googled it. I was like, is this a thing? Do people really get bullied at work? Surely this is not a thing. And I was shocked to learn it was, in fact, a thing. Many Americans experience it. Many women experience it. Many people of color experience it. And for most of those people, there is not remedy or relief for what they're going through. And I was very lucky in being able to find another place of employment, but many people are not. And so there's emotional harm, there's mental harm, but there's also financial harm as a result of workplace bullying. And once I learned this, I got really upset that nobody was talking about this. And as a woman of color, the only response that I got from anybody, all mentors across the board, was if you are going to be a person of color and you are going to work in a traditional work environment, and so when I say corporate, I kind of mean just any traditional 9 to 5 culture, be that nonprofit or government or whatever. If you are a woman of color, then this is what you are going to have to go through. And I said, absolutely not. We should not have to accept being bullied and being mistreated and being disrespected just because we want to go to work and take care of ourselves and feed our families.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, to have to accept that as the status quo is a very sad reality. I'm curious if you could give us some examples of workplace bullying and the trauma that women and folks of color experience. What are some everyday examples that folks can look out for?
Yeah, so I like to level set with kind of the traditional definition of workplace bullying as defined by the Workplace Bullying Institute, which is repeated health harming mistreatment by one or more employees of an employee. So this can be verbal abuse. It can be behaviors that are perceived as threatening, intimidating, humiliating, or work sabotage. So what that might look like in an environment is all of a sudden you're not being invited into meetings that are pertinent to you to do your job, or really important pieces of information that you need to complete a task have not been given to you. It can also look like, consistent practical jokes that are humiliating or harmful. It could look like consistent denial of PTO. So it takes on many different forms in the workplace. But if you think about it from the lens of that definition of, repeated health harming mistreatment, then you can really start to think about all of the ways that that could take shape in a work environment. And I will just tell you, all of the examples that I listed is what I personally experienced.
Yeah, being left out, the surprise feedback, like you
Yes,
said, not being taken seriously. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's a full lack of respect for someone's
absolutely.
identity and humanity because and people I think get confused with this, especially folks in the majority group. If you haven't experienced these things, it is very real and very common for folks in marginalized groups to have this experience. Even as a white woman, I remember countless examples of, just odd behavior at the time. You're like, wait, what just happened? Like, I shared that idea and now it's being co opted by somebody else. Or,
Yeah.
hey, I just wasn't included to that sports outing because they thought I didn't want to come. And while that may not be extreme forms of bullying, it is a lack of inclusion that unfortunately so many folks experience. And it leads to exactly what you experienced, a withdrawal from the workplace, a pivot
Mhm.
to another career or industry or other organization. And so we lose out on top talent with these behaviors, most
Yeah.
certainly. I know you do a lot of work with women in particular and how to overcome the trauma and the bullying in the workplace. What recommendations do you make to the women you work with on how to navigate these tough situations?
Yeah, so a lot of the women that I work with, and I do work primarily with women. I've had a few men who have reached out and said, "Gosh, I experienced the same thing." So I do want to say, everyone can become a target of workplace bullying. Just primarily the people that I have worked with have been women and more specifically women of color. And so I think what's important to remember is there's a period in the toxicity or in the bullying for women where we start to question ourselves. And I think that allows us to sit in the toxicity a lot longer than other people because we haven't really we're not really heard when when we say, hey, something is not right, something is happening here, particularly if you are a person of color. You may not be heard or listened to. And so I think one of the places where I start the work with my clients is allowing them to have the freedom and the space to validate their experience for themselves, because we haven't been able to get the validation from an HR or a director or leadership within the particular company. And so just giving them the space to say, even as simply as, I was bullied at work, and really allowing them to feel whatever the emotions are that they feel around that. And particularly for women of color, sometimes certain emotions are off the table for us. We're not allowed to be angry. Our anger is perceived in different ways, and it's harmful to our careers. But allowing these women the space to be angry if that's what they feel, and letting them know that, yeah, you have a right to feel that way. Because just by going to work and trying to better yourself and feed your family and create at the level that you want to create, you were bullied, you were disrespected, you were discriminated against, and you have a right to be angry about that.
Yep.
And so that's
Yeah.
one of the first places that we start. It's just an acknowledgement of what has happened, and an acknowledgement of the feelings that they have around it.
Yeah. Anger is so interesting how it's handled in the workplace, in particular. Who's allowed to express anger? Who's
Yeah.
not allowed to express anger? What does that anger expression look like? We've normalized this, especially of the majority group, of pounding on things or slamming doors and yelling. And I remember being in workplaces where profanity was normalized as
Yeah,
well, and so harmful because that was not behavior also that I was allowed to exhibit as a woman. And certainly women of
absolutely.
color have even much more of a challenge overcoming that, because there's stereotypes, there's harmful stereotypes that reinforce that narrative of keeping the anger to yourself. So I love that first step of acknowledgement. What else? I mean, if you're getting bullied in the workplace and you don't know what to do, you've acknowledged it, maybe you've compared notes with an ally. What are some other strategies you recommend to address it? And maybe some of it's in the moment or some of it's in reflection afterwards.
Yeah. I think a lot of it for the clients that I have, it does come after the fact. It's really difficult, for all of the reasons that we talked about, for me to tell any person, particularly of a marginalized group, that you should confront bullying head on, because just to be honest with you, I know the consequences of that, which is why a lot of the work that I do is really helping to center the person and kind of helping them to put themselves back together a little bit before you can even get to that point where there's a confidence there of how you go about addressing it. And I think, so a lot of the work that we do kind of is centered around the actual woman. And so after we look at it, acknowledgement, there's a part in the bullying process where you start to believe the bully, because their role is really kind of to diminish the person. And sometimes we can take that on. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping women to start to drop the lies that the toxic work environment has put on you. Specifically for me, one of the things that my bullies, there were multiple of them, said to me was, I was not a good communicator. And the only reason I even got into marketing was because from probably middle school on up, there was not an assessment. You can line them up, anyone, pick one that said I was not a good communicator. And so, of course, they attacked me on my strengths. And I started to believe that and internalize that to the point where it started to become difficult for me to do basic writing things that I had always flourished at. And usually it's some gradient of, you're not good enough or you don't deserve to be here because of X. And so we have to start to peel back that onion a little bit and identify, now, what's the lie that you're carrying? Because there's a reason you're coming to me for coaching. There's a reason you've lost your confidence. So what's the lie that you're carrying? Let's identify it, call it out, and let's start to drop that, because that's how you get back to a place of, now how do you apply for jobs and get out of there? Because the answer that people will say on social media when I start talking about being bullied at work is, are you serious? Just get another job. Well, it's not always that simple to get another job. One, if
Yeah,
you're,
that's
you're in a,
assuming
you're,
some economic privilege too, that you can
correct.
just find a job making the same amount of money.
Correct. But when you're in a job, say, where you have to, the number one thing you have to do is write, and you no longer believe that you're up to par, that makes it really difficult for you to go into an interview and sell yourself.
Yeah, the lies. And it's so interesting. The lies you're told that you then internalize, especially if it's your greatest strength or it's a core capability for the job, it really limits your short-term success if you're
Hmm.
buying into that narrative. It reminds me of gaslighting a little bit,
Yeah,
kind of telling people something so they believe a totally different false version of what's
yeah.
actually happening. It's you, it's not the situation. Seneca, I wonder if, like, to me, it kind of begs a broader question about the systems we have that reinforce the bullying practices to be acceptable and kind of, I don't like the word normal, but it kind of ingrained in the culture, so that these things happen. If you look at it from like a systemic perspective, what would you recommend to organizations that want to make sure they have a zero tolerance policy for bullying? Are there things they can do proactively to make sure that it doesn't happen on an individual by individual basis?
Yeah. So I think one of the most basic things that any organization can do to what you just said is, do you actually have a bullying policy? Do you have anywhere in your corporate policies, procedures, structures, what you will and will not allow that speaks to bullying at all? And most companies don't. So that would be a good place to start. The other thing that I think we can start doing from a systemic level is really getting back to a place where we respect all leadership styles, um, and investing in our leaders. We've all heard the story of someone who was really amazing at their job. And so, as a way to reward them for being amazing at their job, they were given a leadership position. But that all doesn't always equate to the person who does a good job is going to be a good leader.
Yeah, it's that Peter principle, I think someone coined once upon a time of they're a great individual contributor, therefore they're going to be a great manager. And we know those two things are very different. The
They're
top
very
sales
different.
performer is rarely the best sales manager, for example.
Right. They're very different. And I think we have to create space for people to develop those skills that will help them to understand the difference between being really good at my job and being really great at inspiring, encouraging, and supporting the people on my team. And oftentimes in some of these corporate structures, there's just not room for someone to say, I'm not sure that I'm ready for that, or I don't know how to do this, right? Everyone's trying to put on this facade that they automatically know how to lead a team of people when they've never done it before. And companies have also said, yeah, you should know how to do that. Well, a lot of people don't know how to do that. And we can't punish people if we've never given them the resources to be great at that aspect of their job. So I think, creating space, creating opportunities for people to raise their hand and say, you know what, I do need coaching on this, or I do need education on this, and not have that be kind of this mark of shame that, God forbid, a leader, and then I probably should not use that term, but that
I
that that
appreciate the self-correction along the way. I do the same thing. It's like, oops, how did that word just come out of my mouth? But yeah,
Yes,
it's
but this notion that a leader should not know something when we know inherently that there's no way one person could know absolutely everything at all times.
right, right. Yeah, and just leaving room for those different leadership styles and emphasizing respect. I think about too the human skills that are necessary
Yes,
to be a leader so that these environments don't even get created. They get snuffed out right away. It's not
yes,
just respect. I mean, that's kind of a baseline, but empathy, listening, like really listening, asking good questions of your team. Because what I heard in your story was the feedback you were given was very personal. You're not a good communicator. It's really hard for someone to take feedback like that and not get defensive and not to personalize it as me as a holistic bad communicator versus, oh my gosh, I could make some tweaks and do things a little bit differently and be a better communicator. It's how that feedback is packaged that's so important too. And if a leader had given you more of that specific feedback, like, hey, we want to see more frequent communication from you, or hey,
hmm,
your email communication could be more brief, like whatever it is, give people specifics so they can react to versus again, that personalization of the narrative, I'm the problem.
Yeah. And understanding that it is creating a partnership between two people, because understanding too that aspect of leadership, that not everyone on the team is going to be alike. My
Mhm.
emails may never look like the person's emails in the cubicle next to mine, but also accepting some of that too, of there are structures that we have to do, but there are also things that are going to vary between people, and allowing the space for that to happen.
Yeah, there's not one standard email communication technique. There's not one coaching style. But emphasizing, I think, respect, core values and inclusion in how we communicate is what's key. And then letting people communicate in a way that feels authentic to
Yeah.
them. Ah, good stuff. Seneca, I wonder too, just from the stories that you bear witness to and the challenges that you help women and of course, like you said, all genders, but folks that are marginalized in the workplace. If there was one thing you'd point to, and maybe could be helpful for our listeners as far as one thing they could do to watch out for bullying or one thing they could do when they see it happen, what might be some strategies you'd recommend?
Yeah, I would say I like to tell people, never underestimate the importance of an ally. And I also have to, if I can, just share the story of my ally. So I told you guys kind of what I was experiencing, but there was a one colleague of all of the colleagues who witnessed what I was going through. There was one who witnessed what I was going through. And one of the things that she did for me, Julie, was she spoke life into me at a period where I was dying professionally, and I had reached this point where I could not send emails, and she was my buffer. She had watched everything that was going on around me. She was my one trusted source, and so occasionally, which got to be more frequently than occasionally, I would send her emails and just say, "Hey, before I push send on this, will you look this over for me?" And one day she looked at me and she said, "You know what? I'm not going to look over that email for you. You are a highly accomplished communicator. You came to this team with so much experience and skills and knowledge. And while I do not agree with what these other people are doing to you, I am no longer going to sit around and be privy to what you are doing to you. So you read that email, you send it, and we are going to go and have a cup of coffee or pizza or whatever we were doing at the time." And she kind of spoke life into me, which was a turning point for me, that I wasn't alone, and that I was not making this up. I wasn't being too emotional. I wasn't being the angry Black woman. I really was being mistreated in this workplace, and there were other people who saw it. Now that's what she
Mm-hmm.
did to me. That's what she did
Mm.
for me. What I didn't know was this same person had went to different leadership on my behalf to say, "I am witnessing something on my team that I do not think aligns with the values that we have at this company. And I think it needs to be addressed."
Oh, I love that. That's a great ally story, not just of the, speaking and giving you life, like you said, and creating that space and advocating for you one on one, providing that support, but then also making sure to use their influence and proxy to power to influence
Absolutely.
other leaders at the organization. I think that's something all help hopeful or aspiring allies take note of that because it's not just like you said, making sure you don't feel alone. Like I see it. I hope you know that I see it, but then not just taking that one off experience and letting it sit. It's no, now I'm going to do something about it with others. And I really like that package of, hey, this isn't aligned with our values at
Yeah.
this organization because it's hard for someone to defend if values are in question,
Mhm.
right? It's less likely that that's going to create that defensiveness and is probably going to create more of a dialogue about what we can do to be better. Ah, beautiful story, Zenica. I wonder, just in wrapping up, and I appreciate you sharing your vulnerable stories and again, the stories that we hear too often in the workplace about bullying. What might be some resources or tools or recommendations you would make to our listeners that want to learn more?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more specifically about workplace bullying, I think one of the best resources here in the States is the Workplace Bullying Institute. And you can just Google that and all of their resources will come up. They have tons of trainings for people who have been bullied, for workplaces, HR professionals, and coaches and therapists to really address and speak specifically to workplace bullying. If you're interested in any of the programs that I do, my 8-week program that really kind of speaks to putting yourself back together again. We talk about things like confidence. We do not shy away from things like workplace trauma and racialized trauma and how that impacts women of color and how we show up in work and overworking ourselves and burnout. But we also talk about things like what really makes you happy? How do you infuse joy into your life so that you don't end up like me and have your whole identity tied up into work, and so that you're able to really, when someone says to you, you're the worst person on the team, you don't just narrowly accept that. You have the confidence in who you are and what you bring to the table to kind of push back a little bit and say, well, tell me what you mean by that. How am I the
Mm,
worst person on the team? And how can you and I create a plan to be better? Or
mm,
you have the confidence in yourself and who you are enough to say, I will not stay in an environment where I'm not respected, and I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect.
I love that.
That's the work that I do in my group programs or private coaching programs. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, you can learn more about those programs at zenicachatman.com.
Zenica, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. The and what I love about that is kind of like a, oh, I see it differently. Like help me understand like the partnership approach, or, if it's really egregious and very
Yeah.
disrespectful and out of place, like full stop. No, this is not going to continue, right? That's not aligned with
Absolutely.
my
Yeah. And we
values.
talk a lot about, understanding what your values are, because I do think sometimes just as women, we get in this cycle of here's what success looks like and here's what I should be doing. And we start chasing things that really aren't aligned with our values. So I think it's important to take a step back and start to examine in this particular season of life, these are my values, because a question I get so often is, how do I make sure this never happens to me again? I'm doing
Yep.
great. I've recovered from the bullying, but how do I make sure it never happens to me again? And part of that is understanding what your values are, understanding what your non-negotiables are, and never allowing another manager, another paycheck, another person to cross those boundaries.
Yeah. Boundaries, values, non-negotiables. Music to my ears. Sanika, thanks so much for being on this show today. We'll be sure to link to your website in the show notes. And thanks for those wonderful resources and stories. It's really appreciate you being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Truly my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, consider hiring Julie and the Next Pivot Point team to come speak at your organization's next event. We speak on a range of topics from active allyship to inclusive leadership to how to create a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and feels a sense of belonging. Thank you for being on this journey with us. Go to nextpivotpoint.com to learn more.